Yeah.
Back. Back at it like a good snack. Have it. And you know what? Go with a good snack. Water.
Yes, guys. Guess what? Guess what is going on at Coldest Water, y'all? Okay, so Black Friday is going on all month, and it's 50% off select random drops throughout the month and up to 20% off the entire website, y'all. So dope. Go to coldest.com/Black Friday.
Y'all know, check it. Y'all saw that I put on the community board a toll. And I asked, did y'all want to see us review the Constitution? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give my wife the copy. We're going to have a copy right here. So we got a copy. Y'all see Constitution.
I didn't realize you printed it.
I printed it. So what I'm doing is we're going to do a reaction. We react to a video of understanding the Constitution while we're reading the Constitution. So we know this may be a long video. And of course, we're going to do it in parts for y'all. But we're going to be understanding the Constitution from what this guy's talking about. And also, we're going to read it. We the people.
Let's go. I'm so glad we're doing this. I've always wanted to do this. Me too,
because I was wanting to
I always have. Yeah, so let's go.
Let's get it.
Oh, I need my headphones.
New headphones will be here Saturday.
They had to stand for re-election every 2 years.
No, like Bob Ross.
I don't know who that is. Bob Ross.
He used to do the paintings. He used to have the afro, the 70 white guy with the afro, and I always do the paintings and stuff. You know what that is when you see it.
Oh yeah, I do. I think I do. Oh, babe? Yeah, we gotta share my armrest, by the way.
And I gotta get me a new gaming chair, boy. Our chairs used to be level. Now mine sits like 15 feet under.
Whoa.
Constitution is relatively short as important legal documents go. If you don't believe me, take a look at the state constitution.
Okay.
State constitutions are always much, much bigger than the U.S. Constitution. They go into more detail. The U.S. Constitution was intentionally left somewhat inexact. The result has been that it has needed interpretation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go along. But for a short document, there's an awful lot of information in it. And in the hour and a half that we have this evening, we can't study everything. So I've made some editorial choices of what we'll focus on. And primarily what I'm focusing on are constitutional issues and topics that seem to be coming up in the news and in what's going on in the country. And I want to focus somewhat on those so that as these things are happening, hopefully we have a good understanding of what's happening. I've spoken to a number of people who, if they ever really took time to look at the Constitution, it was probably back in high school. So it's been a while.
Right, it's been a minute.
I think to be good informed citizens, we need to review it every once in a while.
No, I agree with that.
I do not want to do this evening, and that's get into pros and cons on issues. There are forums for that. This is not that.
All right.
This is for information,
facts,
for review, for getting us all kind of back up to speed on the basics.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can go to other forums and talk about pros and cons, whether this particular portion of the Constitution is being adhered to and that one maybe isn't. We're not going to get into that tonight. That's for other forums. I welcome questions, as long as let's try to keep them reasonably short, because as we do have a lot of ground to cover in a relatively short amount of time. And one question I'll answer right off the top, some of the spelling is funny. Keep in mind that in the 1780s they were still using British spelling. And also some words get capitalized that we wouldn't bother capitalizing them today. So just go with it. It's what it is. During the Revolutionary War, during the War of Independence from Britain, there really was no document that governed how the United States, what had been the colonies, what were becoming the United States, would be governed. There was no constitution, nothing along those lines. Once the war was over, once independence was won, the states in the Continental Congress the ruling body that had started the war on behalf of the colonies, decided we need some kind of framework on how we're going to govern this new independent nation. And the states came together and they wrote something called the Articles of Confederation. You wouldn't recognize it when you compare it to the Constitution. It left the central government extremely weak. It had no power of taxation. It had to beg money from the different states. Many of the states continued to each one print their own money, charge import and export duties at the state line, something that it's hard to imagine.
Yo, folk were doing what they wanted to do. Somebody was rich. Somebody was getting super rich off that. They could do whatever you want to do. There was no legislation. You were the legislator. You created your own rules.
That's crazy. Go ahead. I need my pencil while we doing that. Keep going. I'm listening. I need a pencil.
What you doing?
I'm looking for my pencil. My lead. Look in that drawer right there real quick and get my lead pencil out because I'm just in case someone. Yeah, you got a pencil. You got a sweet bag. I have lead pencils in here.
This one?
That's a pen.
Oh, here goes one right here.
Thanks. All right. Now we ready. Got to have a writing device just in case.
Right? We cross state lines without even thinking about it anymore.
That's right.
But that was a very different thing. But very quickly, the leaders of the new nation realized this wasn't working. It was too loose. It gave the central government no authority, no power. It was completely at the mercy of the individual states. So it really wasn't like one nation. It was kind of like 13 different nations in a kind of a loose alliance. And they didn't want that. They wanted something stronger. And so in 1787, the Congress of the Confederation called for a constitutional convention. Delegates from most of the states gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. And it's fascinating reading to read stories of that summer, of that convention. And on the back table, when we're done, you might want to take a look. There are quite a few books about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention. It's fascinating reading. And in the end, what they did, what they actually had been called on to do, was to decide how to improve the Articles of Confederation.
Okay.
And in their discussions, they very quickly realized this isn't going to work. We really need to throw it out and start with something completely different, completely new.
Wow. Okay.
And so in the end, they went beyond their mandate from the Congress. They completely ignored the Articles of Confederation and came up with this new document called the Constitution.
Okay.
The Congress accepted it and sent it out to the states for ratification. It was ratified by 1789 and went into effect at that point.
Wow, it must have really been
It's
horrible.
interesting to look at the preamble.
Let's look at the preamble.
Like me, many of you may have had to memorize.
We're reading along at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, eventually all of them did, but not right away. When a new state joins the Union, as it always had to ratify the Constitution as part of that. Initially, they called it that. Very quickly after the nation got going under the Constitution, they would call it that Congress accepted the application for statehood of the new state. But in effect, it's kind of the same thing. So the preamble starts with the words, "We the people."
We the people.
Which has made for one interesting discussion down the centuries.
Yeah.
Is the Constitution something that was created by the people of the United States or through their representatives by the people? Or was it something that was created by the states that had sent the delegates to the convention? And it really depends kind of on your political philosophy about which is right.
Yeah.
But it starts with we, the people
We the
of
people.
the United States.
Yes.
In order to form a more perfect union, I've highlighted some of the things I want to particularly talk about. In the context of the Articles of Confederation not having worked, that phrase really stands out to me. In order to form a more perfect union than what we've had for the last few years under the Articles of Confederation. And to do all of these things that we have read so many times, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and so on. do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So keep in mind, what that says is we the people do ordain and establish. There is a concept in political science of sovereignty. In a monarchy, they refer to the king or queen as the sovereign,
Okay.
in whose name everything is done. Under the United States Constitution, it is we the people
Okay.
who are sovereign.
I got you.
And that, at least in part, is based on this language of the preamble, that it was we the people who ordained and established this Constitution.
Let's
so
go.
right from the beginning, it's an attempt to include everyone, all of the citizens, in this experiment. It was certainly an experiment in 1787.
I bet.
I very strongly believe that it is still an experiment in 2017.
Wow.
Historically speaking, we haven't been doing it very long. And we're still
Tugging.
some noise in the wheels as they grind.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we keep working at it and keep trying to make it better. The first 3 articles, the Constitution is divided up into articles. The first 3 articles establish the 3 branches of the federal government. So we're going to go through that. And if you remember, we're always talking in terms of those 3 branches of checks and balances. The idea of the people who were at the convention was that they didn't want any one branch of the 3 to become all-powerful,
Right.
because that would create an imbalance and a likelihood of some form of dictatorship or tyranny. And that's what they had just thrown off. And so they were trying to avoid it. So as we look at the checks and balances, and also we're going to look at some of the compromises that were made. Politics is the art of compromise, if anything is going to get done.
Okay.
And the Constitutional Convention was a perfect example of compromises. Some of them, 240 years later, don't look maybe so savory. And we'll take a look at some of those. And some of them are, we've just gotten used to them and they work. So Article 1 is the legislative branch. All legislative powers are vested in a Congress, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Right away, that was a compromise in the convention. You had big states among the 13, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, in terms of population. You had small states. You had Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Georgia. Not so big. The big states wanted a one-house legislature based on population. Well, sure they did. The small states wanted a one-house legislature with equal representation from each state. They compromised. That's why we have a 2-house Congress. With 1 house in each way, right? That's not necessarily ordained by nature. There's actually one of the 50 states that has a unicameral legislature. Anybody happen to know which one it is? Nebraska, yeah. All the other 49 all have 2-house legislatures modeled on the Congress.
So when does this one?
Nebraska said, what are we going to waste that time for?
They do their own thing to a degree.
So the members of the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. That was very conscious on their part. Especially keep in mind transportation and communication at the end of the 18th century.
Probably hard.
Right? The only real way they could communicate with their constituents was to go home. And for the ones who lived, way north or way south from Philadelphia or later New York, which became the capital, it was pretty difficult. But they wanted the members of the House to be closer to the people. They had to stand for re-election every 2 years, which gave the people an opportunity to change if they didn't like what their representative was doing.
Okay.
Section 3, or paragraph 3 here, talks about how the number of representatives will be apportioned between the states. Remember, this is the House that is based on representation by population. here is another compromise, and it's a compromise that, as I mentioned, is not so savory, especially from this distance. The southern states, the slaveholding states, wanted the slaves to be counted in full to increase their representation in the House of Representatives. The northern states, the non-slaveholding states, said absolutely not. That's, these are not citizens. They don't function as citizens. We're not going to go with that.
This is some of the biggest part that I wanted to know right here on this part that he's speaking. And also the fact of, Second Amendment being able to keep them, tote them pistols.
It was also in their best interest as smaller states to better balance in their favor the representation. The compromise was that the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, indentured servitude, that's not slavery, right? And excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons, in other words, slaves. So the founders of the Republic counted slaves as 3/5 of a person.
That is
There
so
were members
stupid.
from the North, from the non-slaveholding states, who wanted to write into the Constitution, some of them, an abolition of slavery completely. Southern states certainly weren't going to go along with that. Their fallback position was to ban the importation of any more slaves into the country. The compromise there was the South agreed, okay, we'll let you ban importation of more slaves, but only in 20 years.
Wow.
So there's a provision later on in the Constitution that no law can be passed banning importation of slaves before 1808. So you see the compromises that had to happen. And already at the Constitutional Convention, we're seeing some of the splits, some of the differences that a number of decades later are going to result in the Civil War.
Wow.
Because these compromises could hold for only so long. Paragraph 5, the House of Representatives shall choose their speaker. That's not all important. And the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment. Now, that's a word that's starting to be thrown around. However you feel about that, it's out there. And we have to understand how it works. Some of us remember that impeachment of a president has happened in our lifetime.
Yep.
Back in the 1990s. Now, impeachment is not removal from office.
Yep.
Impeachment is like an indictment. And it's the House of Representatives that the Constitution specifically gives the authority to come down with that indictment or to impeach any federal officer, including the president. And as we'll see, it's the Senate that then sits as a trial court for the impeachment. And again, those of us who remember, old enough to remember the 90s, remember that that's what happened with President Clinton. Yeah. That is correct. There is no recall process for federal offices. I've heard a little bit of discussion recently about some people wanting to add that. Wouldn't hold my breath. Yeah, no, that's a state-by-state thing, and it specifically has to do with state offices in the states that have it. No recall under the federal Constitution, no. However, one of the things that is in the Constitution is that each house has sole authority to recognize the membership of somebody who has been elected, or to say that this person has not been elected properly, or a member of the House, or that the House can deny membership to a member of the House by certifying that the election was not proper, or something along those lines. The Senate can do the same with one of theirs. Doesn't happen very much, but they do have the authority to do that. So the Senate, composed of 2 senators from each state, notice this, chosen by the legislature of each state. That was the original arrangement, so that the senators originally weren't really representing directly the people of their state. They were representing the state government. They were representing the state legislature.
Wow.
As we're going to see, that was changed by an amendment in the early 20th century. So that for a little over 100 years now, senators are elected by direct vote of the people. And that fits in with
So, did you know that the legislative branch is the branch that they're the ones that write the laws. I remember starting to remember some of this during one of my communication classes when I was in school for like a journalist, because you go over this and that's how you learn about the laws and all that kind of stuff. What am I laughing? Was it maybe in communication law? I don't know. I just remember this now. Part of it.
So the legislators write the laws.
Mm-hmm. They're the ones that write the law. I want to say the judicial branch is the one that makes sure they're getting carried out. And there's one other. It's three branches. I forgot the other. But he gonna tell it. Let's see if I'm right.
Interesting pattern that we will see when we get to the amendments. As amendments were added over the last couple of centuries, many of them have to do with expanding who gets to vote in federal elections. There's never been one that contracts who gets to vote, that makes the numbers smaller. There are several, and we will see that expand it. At the time of the Constitutional Convention and the first few decades of the United States government, the states were left to decide who gets to vote in all elections, including federal elections. In fact, in a couple of places, the Constitution, see if I can find it, says that I'm not going to go looking for it, that those who may vote for these federal offices is defined by who gets to vote for the most numerous branch of the state legislature in each state. So the state got to choose who got to vote, and in that day and age, it was white, male property owners.
Wow.
Adult, of course. Over 21. And as we're going to see, over the term of our history, that has been steadily expanded. So, Senate begins 2 from each state. It's kind of funny, there are some states that have 2 senators but only 1 member of the House of Representatives. There's a special election in Montana, I think actually tomorrow, to fill that vacant seat. And Montana is a very small state in population. So they get 2 senators, they get 1 member of the House of Representatives. It's kind of funny. I'm originally from California. We have 2 senators, and at last count, I think 56 members of the House, something like that. It's the largest state in population. The vice president shall be president of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. There's been talk about that in the news since the last election. The Republicans have a 4-seat majority in the Senate, 52 to 48. So if 2 Republicans don't vote or vote with the Democrats, it's a tie vote, but the vice president then gets to vote.
And that's
since he is a Republican, chances are
that
whatever the Republican majority wants passed, he will go with them. But that's the only time the vice president gets to vote. Yes? Question is, what's the rationale for a senator serving 6 years instead of 2? Or 4. Again, they wanted the House to be close to the people, but they saw the Senate as a kind of a moderating influence on what they expected to be a more populist House of Representatives, where they thought that debates in the House might be more emotional, more ideological, and they saw the Senate as a body of statesmen who would kind of be more even-keeled and more statesman-like. And so a 6-year term would allow them to be kind of above the fray for a good part of time until they had to face. And keep in mind, again, for the first 100 and some years, they were elected by the legislatures. So, their electors, the people they had to lobby to get elected, was a very small group.
Yeah.
And so it was this idea of being above the fray, of being more statesman-like.
And just to go back, just something to go back. So there were all across the board voting restrictions. Of course, for blacks, we were considered 1/3 of a person, so you weren't even a full person to be able to vote. And then, but if you weren't a white man that owned property, nobody else could vote anyway. So there was pure strict rules that don't, that are done with now back then. So that, because I know when people say, I hear this a lot of times, blacks, we weren't even meant to vote. Yeah, and neither were women or any others. We might have been considered less of a person, which was horrible, but nobody else could just go vote. Except, just say, they ain't a whole person. They can't vote. Everybody else can vote. No. It was specific.
Yeah. Okay.
A third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. And in fact, there's a whole paragraph here that we're not going to spend time on, where they say that, once the first Senate gets elected, and you have to fill all the seats right away, the first thing the Senate has to do is divide itself up into 3 classes. One group that'll be up for re-election in 2 years, another group that'll be up for re-election in 4 years, another group that'll serve the full 6 years. And that got that staggered election thing going that we've had ever since. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. And when the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice becomes the head of the court, in effect, and presides over the Senate, which again is what happened in the 90s with President Clinton. And no person shall be convicted without 2/3 of the members present. So that's a high bar, as it should be. And paragraph 7 is kind of interesting, too. All the Senate can do, or the House in impeaching and the Senate in trying, is they can throw him out of office, which, by the way, hasn't happened yet.
I was going to say they haven't.
We've had 2 impeachments of presidents.
But nobody's
in both cases, they were not convicted. First one, or the second one, as we've been saying, was President Clinton in the 90s. Anybody remember who the first one was?
When that,
Andrew Johnson, right after the Civil War, right after Lincoln's assassination. He was not real popular with the Congress, but he was saved by 1 vote from being thrown out of office. But a conviction by the Senate is not a basis for a criminal conviction. It doesn't mean that the president couldn't be, who's been removed from office by impeachment, couldn't be tried for a crime once he's out of office.
Oh, wow.
Although
that's a trip. So you just at the house chilling. They be like, and they show up, them suits come up to your door.
Wow.
Step out, sir.
That hasn't happened either. The one case where some people thought it might happen, we've had 1 resignation of a president. Anybody? Nixon. Right, in the 1970s.
Okay.
There were some people who wanted to see him criminally tried. After he resigned the office, President Ford, his successor, immediately gave him a pardon, and that was off the books. But it could have happened. Here, as I mentioned this before, each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. Section 7, paragraph 2, every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it becomes law, be presented to the President. If he approves, he signs it, it becomes law. If he doesn't, he returns it. And we use the term today, veto. The word isn't in the Constitution. It's just something that got into usage. If I remember my high school Latin correctly, I believe the word veto means I forbid. In vetoing a bill, the president has to send it back to Congress with a message of why, and perhaps with suggestions of, if you clean up this provision a little bit and change that one over there, then I'd sign it. So it's not just a flat no. It's a working together, the 2 branches.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got, everything that's going to become law has to be passed by both houses of Congress in identical language. So there's a check and a balance between the 2 houses of the Congress. Right? If they don't both pass it in the same language, it isn't law. In fact, you can see that going on right now. The health bill that the House of Representatives passed a couple of weeks ago, the Senate, the Republican majority in the Senate has basically said, we don't like your bill, we're going to write our own health bill.
Okay.
Which means, and if that passes the Senate, then the 2 houses have to come together in a conference committee and work it out. find ways of coming up with an identical bill that both houses will pass. That doesn't happen, it doesn't become law.
Wow. Let's
If
go.
they do pass it, it goes to the president. Here's a check and a balance on the Congress. If the Congress oversteps or does something that the president thinks is wrong, for whatever reason, the president can veto it. Gives a fair amount of power to the president, but there's now a check and a balance on the veto that the Congress can reconsider. And if both houses of the Congress vote to by 2/3 of each house, not any longer a simple majority, which is normally what you need the first time around. If each house repasses the same bill with a 2/3 majority, it's law in spite of the president's veto.
Dang.
They could, but the president would have to sign the bill that the Congress passes, and may not want to. So all of this is, the checks and balances on each other to make sure that nobody runs away with the power. Yes.
And thank God that we don't live in a communist dictatorship or, anything that's just where it's like, it's about what I want to do and I'm going to make it happen. And there's no checks and balances. I can do this, I can do that. That's what makes chaos, because what you might deem is right might not be right. It might be good for you on this side, but then over here, you done ruined something. So, yeah, I like the check and balance ability.
You're right. An executive order is not law. What it really is an instruction to the departments of the executive branch. Here's the boss saying, this is what I want you departments that work for me, this is what I want you to do, or not to do. And in fact, if you look at the executive orders that have been signed since January 20th, there have been quite a few of them, and some of them have been quite controversial, and some of them have been suspended by the courts. What they really are is they affect the functioning of the executive departments. The executive orders about immigration and refugees is, in effect, instructions to the immigration service as to who to let in. This doesn't need law. There is an immigration and naturalization law that governs that, but every law that's passed by Congress is vague enough that you then need a whole set of rules as to actually how is it going to be applied.
Makes sense.
And there is a big body of literature called the Federal Register. If you ever really have trouble sleeping, I highly recommend it. But it's what's called administrative law.
Write that down, the Federal Registry.
Okay.
Anybody that works with any executive department of the federal government has to know the rules that apply to that agency really, really well. You can see an example of how those work. Right now, there's an issue about net neutrality that's before the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC has issued a proposed new set of rules, but statute requires the executive department that's proposing new rules to make it public for a comment period. And members of the public have the right to send in their comments. This is something as citizens we should all be paying attention to. Keep an eye on things that are of interest to us. You are just as qualified as anybody, as a voter, to send in your opinion. And then the agency, in this case the FCC, once that comment period is over, I think it's 90 days, but don't hold me to that, they, or their staff at least, will take all of the comments that have been submitted and present them to the commission in some kind of a shortened version so that they can take into account public opinion about these rules. Case law is what the courts decide.
Case law.
I mentioned earlier that a lot of what's in here is vague enough to need interpretation as to how it gets applied. And I was actually going to make it a little bit of a quiz when we get to Article 3. But we're very used to the idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what a federal statute means. Actually, in most cases, it's the federal courts of appeals. Because in most cases that are in federal courts, you don't have the right of appeal to the Supreme Court. You have to apply and ask them to accept your case, and in most cases they don't. They're only doing maybe 200 cases a year.
Wow.
Wow.
So most federal cases...
And that means it must be the toughest of the tough. Like, to get to that level.
Mm-hmm.
So that means thousands of cases are getting cut off at the neck.
So I really wonder what makes them approve a case to be able to say, okay, yeah, we'll take this. Y'all can bring y'all's case and fight this case here. I wonder if is it certain crimes that have the ability to apply and get approved versus lesser crimes. I wonder.
Or it's big enough,
mm-hmm.
and it sparks enough interest, or it affects maybe a large amount of people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking so for it to be weeded out just to only get so many, it has to be a very defined reason for this to make it pass here.